In this recording, we're going to assess the view that increasing trade is a more effective strategy for development than increasing aid. So, trade is the act of buying, selling, or exchanging commodities between countries, whereas aid is a flow of resources from developed to developing countries in the form of financial grants or a loan with interest. There is a relationship between trade and economic growth, as the world's top 5 exporting countries export and profit from 40% of the world's goods. However, the bottom 50 countries export less than 1% of the world's goods. So, in terms of theory, modernization theory believes that developing countries need to increase their share of world trade to become more competitive. And neoliberals argue that aid just breeds dependency, so trade is the only strategy left for development. Developing countries need to maximise their competitive advantage in order to achieve growth. Developing countries have more natural resources than the developed world, and they have a potential workforce that can be paid relatively low wages, but they lack the knowledge to turn resources into profit, so they need investment from wealthy nations and TNCs. Many developing countries have set up free trade zones or EPZs in order to attract TNCs. They offer incentives such as tax breaks, low wages, and lax health and safety legislation. However, the issue of trade has been raised by dependency and people-centred development. They argue that one of the main problems with trade is that many developing countries are too dependent on low-value exports. The economies of many developing countries are dependent on just one product. For example, Ethiopia is dependent on income from coffee exports. This means that fluctuations in prices of that one product can have devastating effects for farmers, and it may be difficult for them to support their families. The fair trade movement believes that the term free trade is not fair, so they aid to alter the terms of trade so that producers in developing countries receive a higher proportion of the profit. Cole believed that increased trade is an aspect of globalization, and trade has risen over the world and for most developing countries. You can use the example by Swift that shows the fair trade usefulness. In the 1970s, the world cocoa price fell. Guyana farmers switched to crops to feed themselves, and Guyana found itself in economic difficulty. It attempted a structural adjustment program from the IMF and World Bank to rescue the economy. But this involved removing subsidies, therefore increasing their difficulties. Now, Guyana chocolate is nearly all fair traded, and their hope is that Western consumers will pay more for a high quality and ethically sound product. However, the problem of fair trade is that by focusing on achieving a fair price for poor farmers, the movement doesn't address the issue of mechanism and industrialization. Fair trade can also tie farmers into a relationship of dependence with charity-minded shoppers in the West, and fair trade only provides a few extra pennies for farmers, which will not allow them to catch up with the West. So now we're going to move over and look at aid. So in terms of public aid, you have bilateral aid and multilateral aid. So bilateral aid is country-to-country direct aid. It's known as the official development assistance, and it's administered by the Foreign Office and worth roughly £3 billion per year. However, the problem with bilateral aid is that it's tied by sources, because it means that developing countries can only use the aid to buy specified goods, and it's tied by project because assistance can only be used for a specific project, such as building a road. Multilateral aid is UK to agencies indirect aid, and countries donate capital to agencies such as the World Bank and IMF, and this is worth roughly £2 billion per year. However, multilateral aid demands conditionality in return for loans, and the IMF and World Bank then makes a profit through it. In terms of private aid, there are 3 types: commercial bank aid, non-governmental organisation aid, and emergency aid. Commercial bank aid is highly controversial, as military rulers can use it to buy weapons, and white elephant schemes cause debt which has been noised onto the nation state. For example, Mobutu in Zaire bought motorways to his home in the jungle. And NGO aid, they raise money through charity and currently raise around £50 million per year. They tend to target the poorest and work with smaller groups rather than governments. NGO aid can be seen as the best form of aid because they target the people who need it the most. However, Hal Ward has argued that they support violent regime changes such as Christian aid in Haiti did, and Collier argues that they mislead the public because he states that they know it's crap but it sells t-shirts. NGO aid is also undemocratic and has a corporate style, and they may cause more problems, such as if you give your clothes to a developing country, then it may mean that the textile industry is destroyed. So if we talk about emergency aid, this is humanitarian relief in response to specific disasters such as a tsunami or the Japanese earthquake. But the problem with emergency aid is that it's linked to bilateral aid, and that has the same problems that bilateral aid does. In terms of theory, dependency theory argues that aid creates unequal relationships as it functions to bring about underdevelopment and to only benefit a Western monopoly of wealth and power. And neo-Marxists argue that aid is linked to the political agenda as it supports the political ideology of the West, and it's linked to the economic agenda as aid is tied, and at the heart of all official aid is the expansion of global capitalism. Also, neoliberals argue that aid encourages corruption as it's misused. However, modernisation theory takes a more positive approach of aid. They argue that official aid is a crucial component of Rostow's takeoff theory, and aid should be aimed to change cultural attitudes such as meritocracy. Elites in developing countries will be the primary beneficiaries, but in the long run, wealth will then trickle down to help the country develop. You also have the issue that aid is linked to debt, and dependency believes that debt has been brought about by a number of factors. One of these is colonialism, as developing countries are over-dependent on a few cash crops. The second is little of the money borrowed was spent on effective economic development. And the third is that during the recession, interest rates increased, which meant the debt was even higher. And George argues that there are 6 problems of debt that can result in a debt boomerang. In order to remember the 6 debt boomerangs, you can remember it by remembering the acronym MUTED. M stands for migration and brain drain. U stands for unemployment. T stands for taxes. E stands for environmental damage, which leads to global warming. D stands for the production of illegal drugs, and then there's also war, but that doesn't fit in. The debt crisis has developed substantially since 2008. For example, the problem in Greece, which has led to IMF and EU bailouts. And there are also other evaluation points of aid, as Collier believes that aid is ineffective because it leads to the conflict trap, natural resources trap, being landlocked by bad neighbours and bad governance. However, Sachs takes a more positive approach and believes that aid works when it's practical, targeted, science-based and measurable. For example, smallpox was wiped out and helped to increase yields across Africa. However, the Social Democrats have argued that aid is inappropriate and ineffective. So in conclusion, both trade and aid are useful, but they also both have their problems. NGOs might be a better way to work with smaller groups of people. Charities like Oxfam and VSO raise money to help people in developing countries. They are also more useful than other forms of aid because they are non-political, so they can work with a wider range of groups, less bureaucratic, so they can work faster and more effectively rather than governmental organisations. They are smaller, and they also focus on local groups to provide necessary help.